Let's take a look at the stages of how organizational conflict unfolds. This model, developed by Pondy, illustrates the dynamic process of conflict. It's not the only one, of course, but one of the most well-known and widely used. It centers on 5 different stages: latent conflict, perceived conflict, felt conflict, manifest conflict, and conflict aftermath. Let's use a story to frame these different stages, taken from Allen and Sawney's book on criminal justice administration and management, a great resource. I've used it in my classes, and one of the primary sources I'm consulting for this series. In a typical town, the judges and prosecutors are unhappy with the local police for pushing forward too many cases. Many of these cases have insufficient evidence that cannot stand the line of questioning during trial and have to be dismissed. Nevertheless, these cases use up the time of the courts and the prosecutors, which stretches them beyond their capacity and results in them having to work overtime. A few months later, there is an investigative news article that reports about the practice of a quota system adopted by the police. This public information makes the judges and prosecutors furious about having to deal with many frivolous cases with insufficient evidence, which is extending them beyond capacity. The judges react by adopting an inconsistent policy in scheduling trials or in granting telephone calls to defendants awaiting trial in jail. The judges' actions cause dissension and unrest among the jail population, which increases the work for the sheriff and the staff. As a reaction, the sheriff and the staff start delivering the defendants coming from jail for trial later than their scheduled times, which wastes the time of the jurors and the court. So you can see there's a lot of problems here that built on each other. So let's take a look at how the different stages unfolded. The first stage is latent conflict, where there isn't a conflict yet, but there may be something bubbling underneath the surface. Some tensions are there, but not yet openly acknowledged or discussed. This is the earliest stage of conflict, where a conflict could arise if conditions remain as they are and are on the same trajectory with no intervention, but the tensions could also dissipate as well. How latent conflict evolves really depends on a multitude of factors, most notably being the actions taken by the parties that are involved. In the story example, the judges and prosecutors are not happy with how the police have been giving them cases without sufficient evidence, which has been wasting valuable and scarce resources. The second stage is perceived conflict. This is where the conflict becomes a bit more overt, and at least one of the parties involved recognizes that there may be some kind of disagreement or tension there. This often comes after long periods of latent conflict. Some things that were just kind of simmering slowly under the surface start to become more prominent, occur more regularly, or perhaps start to be recognized as cumbersome, irritating, or annoying. In our story, months go by with this kind of circumstances where the police are sending prosecutors and judges cases without sufficient evidence, and it slowly over time starts to wear down on their patience. There are many ways that perceived conflict can come up. Something as simple as an informal conversation where someone reveals a frustration casually to a colleague who then seconds it by saying they have the same concern can be the initial spark to move from latent to perceived conflict, where it's acknowledged for the first time. The third stage is felt conflict. This is where the parties involved start talking more openly about the conflict. Disagreements become more obvious, and even some arguments may begin to pop up. This is the point where the tension continues to build and it's kind of hard to ignore. It's kind of more obvious to everybody. The overall environment is getting more difficult to work in and everyone is on edge. This is where perceived and felt conflict can reinforce one another. As when a conflict reaches this stage, sometimes even the smallest hints of perceived conflict or slight or whatnot can become elevated and taken in a negative way. Something that would have been brushed off in the past is now taken far more seriously, and perhaps misread or taken out of context in this tension-filled environment. In our story, a newspaper article comes out discussing a quota system used by the police, and prosecutors and judges become aware that their time is being wasted and that there is a problem, and they now begin to discuss it openly amongst themselves. Often, it's not a situation where something as clear-cut as a newspaper article lays everything out, but the conflict is evident to everyone now, and the different parties start to go back and forth in response to or retaliation to what the other is doing. And this is when we move from felt conflict to manifest conflict, stage 4. This is when the band-aid's ripped off, the glue holding everything somewhat together comes loose, and everything is out in the open to the point where it's completely unmistakable to anyone that's involved. This is when individuals usually take actions to minimize their exposure to conflict or the conflict's impact on them. But these actions often negatively impact others who didn't have anything to do with the conflict to begin with. In our story, the judges began scheduling trials inconsistently, limiting defendant call times, creating problems for the police that were housing defendants in their jail. The police then responded by bringing the defendants in later than their scheduled trial time, wasting the court's time, and the time of those who didn't have anything to do with the original conflict, including both the defendants and the jurors, who now have become pawns in this inner organizational power struggle between the police and the court. The final stage, stage 5, is the aftermath of the conflict, when the immediate conflict is resolved, at least to some extent, but the tensions remain over what just occurred. This can linger for some time. You can relate this to your own relationships. Think, for example, of when you may have gotten into an argument with a significant other, a friend, or family member that had been building for some time beforehand that ended up in a shouting match, and then you talked it out a little bit later on. The immediate conflict may be resolved, but you still feel the hurt of whatever was said or done in the heat of the moment, and you're still a bit cautious and have your guard up for at least a while, maybe days or even weeks. And you may still feel that the underlying conflict hasn't been fully resolved, and there are still larger issues under the surface that may come up again, which brings you right back to stage 1 with latent conflict. Same idea here. Conflict aftermath can be a lengthy period where time heals wounds and it makes it easier to move forward, but it's also a period where the conflicts can arise again, and the stages can repeat themselves. How well it is navigated from there depends on how well the parties work through the conflict and develop strategies for preventing it from occurring all over again, which is something that we'll come back to in one of the next videos on conflict. So those are the stages of conflict. Is this a helpful model for thinking about how conflict unfolds? Do you think it will be helpful for navigating through a conflict wherein you find yourself in one, to recognize and find ways to mitigate it at earlier rather than at later stages? Have you been involved in a conflict where you tried to ease the tensions at earlier stages? What worked and what didn't? Or a conflict where, in retrospect, with the benefit of hindsight, you could have addressed the conflict in a better way had you recognized it earlier? Comment down below and let me know. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thanks for watching, see you next time, and have a good one.